Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to run everyone through a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, only the host will be able to see the list of all attendees. All participants' lines will be muted to ensure there is no background noise. Following our presentation, we will be holding a Q&A session. If you have a question at any time for our speakers during the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A tab located on your screen. You can also submit your questions at the end of the session. For any questions our speakers won't have time to answer today, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the event. We are recording today's webinar, and we plan to send out a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the recording and presentation slides within the next couple of days. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's presentation. We're joined by MarkMonitor experts Matt Serlin and Kiran Malancharuvil. Matt Serlin is Vice President of Global Client Services for MarkMonitor. He brings over 13 years of experience in the domain name industry and brand protection. He is responsible for all facets of the company's global customer service and support operations for domain name, brand protection, and anti-piracy services, including clients, third-party registry, and registrar relationships. As a recognized authority on domain name issues, Matt regularly advocates on behalf of corporate brand holders at ICANN meetings, where he previously served on the executive committee of the registrar stakeholder group. He also serves as a senior domain name consultant, working with MarkMonitor clients on portfolio consolidation as well as domain name and online brand protection strategy development. Kiran Malancharuvil is the policy counselor for MarkMonitor, responsible for monitoring the legal, legislative, political, and regulatory environment around brand ownership. She represents the interests of MarkMonitor clients at ICANN through the Intellectual Property Constituency, at INTA as a member of the Internet Committee, and at IACC as a member of the Internet Task Force. Kiran has taken a leading role defending brand and consumer interests on policy and advocacy issues related to the new gTLD program, registrar accountability, accessibility of website ownership data, and consumer fraud. She is a trademark attorney with experience in international and domestic trademark prosecution, litigation, anti-counterfeiting efforts, and brand protection counseling. I am going to pass it over to Kiran now while Matt's working out some technical issues. So Kiran's going to walk us through the agenda.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar. As Gina stated, Matt Serlin generally kicks us off. He's having a little technical issues from our office in Boise, but hopefully he will be able to join us shortly. So I will take the ball and run with it. So today we're going to be talking about what happened in Marrakech, Morocco at ICANN 55. We're going to go through the status of the new gTLD program and preview some of what's up for next rounds and the new rights protection mechanisms and new gTLDs and the application to all gTLDs moving forward. We're going to talk about the historic milestone that happened in Marrakech regarding the IANA stewardship transition and ICANN accountability. We're going to discuss the future of Whois, which is now called Registration Directory Services, and the policy development that's happening with that. We're also going to talk a little bit about abuse reporting, registrars, and ICANN compliance and what's going on with that, as well as the inter-registrar transfer policy, which is set to be implemented this year. So without further ado, I will jump right into it. In Marrakech, Morocco, we met March 5th through the 10th for our traditional ICANN meeting, the first of 2016, which has been a busy year so far. The main highlight of the meeting was the historic transition of the IANA functions from the U.S. government to ICANN. We reached a major milestone as a community. We were able to finalize a plan for transition, both from a technical perspective and also from an accountability perspective, ensuring that ICANN as an organization remains accountable to everyone in the community without undue influence from any one group. And we were able to present that plan on the last day to the United States government for approval, and that was a huge culmination of an almost 3-year process, and we were able to break out the champagne and have a lot of fun as a community to applaud the hard work of the volunteers that developed that plan. Also in Marrakech, we had a lot of policy development processes, or PDPs, launching. We have one on Whois, or Registration Directory Services, as I mentioned. We have a review of the new gTLD program from a consumer choice, competition, and trust perspective. We are launching the review of the rights protection mechanisms, including the Trademark Clearinghouse, Sunrise, the Uniform Rapid Suspension process, and then eventually the UDRP. We also launched the PDP related to subsequent rounds and had our first face-to-face meeting for that. Another highlight in Marrakech, Morocco, was that it was Fadi Shahade, the media past ICANN CEO's last meeting. And we really applaud the work that he did over the last 3 years to foster ICANN and the ICANN community through the accountability and the IANA transition process. And the new CEO, whose name is Göran Marby, who's from Sweden and is in the telecommunications business, attended the meeting. He is not the CEO yet. He will assume the role in May of 2016. And in the meantime, the president of ICANN's Global Domains Division, Akram Atalla, will be acting CEO. But Mr. Marby did take a look around. He attended some board meetings. A lot of the community members got to meet him and talk to him. And overall, he had a pretty positive review. So we were excited to see him and meet him, and we're looking forward to seeing how he kind of takes the ball and runs with it from Fadi. And again, we thank Fadi for all of his hard work in the past 3 years. Okay, so I'm going to check and see if Matt's online. He's not. Okay, so I'm going to just keep talking. So we'll go forward to discuss the status of the new gTLD program. We have some good information for you as far as updated statistics are. We've reached 15.9 million new gTLD registrations, according to NTLDstats.com. So I think that is slower growth than what we've expected, but still a lot of information, a lot of good TLDs out there, and good growth for the industry. The next slide is the top new gTLDs. We still see that .xyz is still huge, but the majority of the TLDs are sort of a mixed bag at this point. The top 20 most popular new gTLDs that we see as a corporate registrar are as follows. .sex, .porn, .adults, .sex are all very popular for defensive registrations. I'm sorry, we're having some slide issues. Let me see if we can move forward. Okay, I think we've got the slides advancing. If somebody can post in the chat if you see that. I apologize for the technical issues that we're having. Okay, so corporate, okay, great. So corporate new gTLDs, we're still seeing a huge amount of defensive registrations, and so that's why we see sort of the top ones as they are on the slide. Again, we see a lot of the verticals are registering. We've got the pharmaceutical industry, which is important to a lot of our clients, the financial services one, entertainment and media, and again, our domain clients do get notifications as these verticals are coming out for registration so that you can monitor and discuss with your customer service representatives which one you're best suited to register in. So altogether, we've got 938 new gTLD strings delegated. Over 1,200 registry agreements are signed. We have seen new gTLDs changing hands, with probably more of that to come. We've got new launches and business models, And universal acceptance is an issue I think that Matt is probably best suited to talk to, so I'll skip over that for now. So as we move into the policy work that we're doing with new gTLDs.
I think we got Matt back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, they are.
Matt.
Excellent.
Good timing. Universal acceptance. Go.
Yes. Thank you, Kiran, for filling in, and apologies, everyone, for the technical issues that we were having. Let's just pause here for a minute, and as Kiran touched on a couple of these points, I just want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into a couple of these here, and really starting with that middle bullet there, that, you know, we're 2 years into the launch of new gTLDs, and we sort of thought that, you know, we'd see activity kind of slow down, that you wouldn't really have as many registries launching now as we've had, you know, in the previous 2 years, which is true. But really now what we're seeing, and that point talks to it, is that you've got several gTLD registries that are not only changing hands, so they're, you know, going from one registry operator to another registry operator for a variety of reasons. But also what's a little bit more concerning we're seeing as well is that registry operators, you know, whether it be 1 or 2 years in, are kind of taking a look at the performance of the TLD and making changes potentially that are material to how the TLD operates and how we as a registrar need to interact with them. And so, you know, we're dealing with a number of proposals that have been submitted to ICANN to change registry agreements that will ultimately impact MarkMonitor as a registrar, potentially folks that are registering these domain names as well. And so, you know, we're keeping a really close eye on it. We're trying to work with our registry partners to get a view into when those things are coming. But I think we're going to start to see more of that as, you know, whether it be people's financial projections based on the TLD, that maybe they're not seeing the kinds of volumes that they would have anticipated with the policies they have in place. And so they're looking to maybe change some of that stuff. But it's going to start to get a little bit more prevalent, where the number of launches per se isn't really as significant as it has been in the past couple of years. But all these kind of registry changes and things like that is going to really continue to impact folks as we move forward. So again, we're keeping a close eye on that and doing our best to mitigate the impact that has on folks. Kiran, as I was just entering, was talking a little bit about universal acceptance. And for those of you that aren't aware, really what universal acceptance is, things like email programs that are designed and built to only accept, you know, TLDs with 3 characters because no one really envisioned other things, you know, other than .com or .net or .org, all of which are 3 characters. And so something like a, you know, .company email address or a .email address, a lot of the sort of internet protocols and software developers really haven't built or changed their programs to account for new gTLDs. And so there is a pretty significant push underway within both the ICANN community and also the broader technical community to change the protocols to make new gTLDs more universally acceptable, thus the term universal acceptance. So it's going to be, you know, an evolution. It's going to take a fairly significant amount of time to get there. It's not going to happen overnight, but it definitely is something that a lot of folks are doing a fair amount of work on and are trying to really just, you know, raise awareness by, you know, ensuring that when people are writing new programs and developing new software, that they take this new gTLD landscape into account. So I think with that, I'm going to toss it over back to Kiran to talk a little bit about the work that's going on related to the subsequent rounds. You know, the one thing that I will talk to real quick is just the timing. You know, we've had a fair number of people that have asked us what the timing is for the next round. You know, a bunch of people that maybe evaluated applying for a .brand in the first round and didn't, or whatever the case may be. And so, there is this discussion within the ICANN community about whether or not we bifurcate the rounds and allow things like .brands or community or geographic applicants to apply in a sort of pre-round ahead of the more generic terms to be applied for. But really, when you look at the timelines, and I think Kiran has a slide after this that'll show it, you're really looking at 2018 for the earliest. Yeah, there it is. 2018 is really the earliest. And then I think realistically a broader round probably is going to be more in the 2019 to 2020 range. If for any of you that have been around the domain name space in the ICANN world long enough, you'll know that ICANN timeline commitments are kind of a moving target. So with that, I'll let Kiran talk about a lot of the policy work that's going on that really was happening in Marrakech and will happen really throughout the course of this year and beyond. So Kiran?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for joining. Back to safety for me, talking about the policy world and not the domain world. Aren't you glad that we have Matt as an expert in the field that he's in and me where I am? So here we go. We can talk a little bit about the policy work on the subsequent rounds. The working group charter was adopted by the community on January 21st, 2016. We have a great leadership team in place to foster us through this somewhat complicated process. We've got Jeff Newman, a good colleague of ours, as well as Steve Coates from Twitter, and Aubrey Doria from the non-commercial stakeholder group. So a good group of veterans and newcomers alike. So the organization of the work is going to be fairly complicated because we have to coordinate with a number of reviews that are happening interdependently, but will have to coordinate. The GAC review of the new gTLD program will have to occur. The CCT review, which we talked about earlier, that's the Consumer Choice Competition and Trust review, and also the RPM review, which may be integrated into the subsequent round CDP or may remain as it is now, which is separate. So lots of sort of interdependability with the policy work in new gTLD subsequent rounds, and we're just sort of starting now to organize things and to get a sense of who is joining the group to represent what interests, where our strengths lie, and then sort of splitting out the work according to what we've laid out in the charter, which was laid out and finalized last year by the community in a discussion group on that same issue. So then Matt already talked about timing. I agree that the earliest we'll see any round is 2018, and much later for any open rounds. So here's the estimated timeline that's still up on the ICANN website. As you can see, we're already about a year behind on this timeline, so as a community. But it's still valuable for us to look at, as I said in our last ICANN recap, so that we can understand sort of what needs to happen as far as all the different reviews and surveys and things that need to happen before we can actually come to a conclusion about how to run any subsequent rounds of the new gTLD program. So we've also got the RPM review policy development process that is kicking off now. We did have some discussion about it in Marrakech at the GNSO, or Generic Name Supporting Organization level. The GNSO Council Liaison, Phil Corwin, who's from the business constituency, presented the issues to the community, and the community went ahead and adopted the working group charter on March 15th, so just last week. And then yesterday, on March 21st, the official call for volunteers did go out. Now, this is going to be a big one for our clients and for brand owners, for people that are concerned about IP rights, consumer rights, because this is sort of all of the things that we saw a lot of problems with when the new gTLD program first launched. We're going to be talking about the Trademark Clearinghouse. We're going to be talking about Sunrise. We're going to be talking about claim services, the Uniform Rapid Suspension System, which some people love and some people are very critical of. We will be discussing issues around premium pricing, reserved names, blocking, and all of the issues that brand owners have vocalized in the past couple of years since the new gTLD program has launched. The second phase of the RPM review is going to be about the UDRP, which is the Uniform Dispute Resolution Procedure. Very, very popular and an important policy that was developed ages ago through ICANN and is certainly ripe for a review, according to many in the community. So we will look forward to addressing that issue separate from the other RPMs. And then, of course, as we go through these issues, we're not only going to be looking at the efficacy of the RPMs in the new gTLD program, but also the feasibility of applying the new gTLD RPMs to existing TLDs, so the 22 or so legacy TLDs like .com. So, which I think is desirable for a lot of brand owners and consumer protection advocates. So another big issue in Marrakech, as I've spoken about before, was the IANA stewardship and the ICANN accountability issue. So as I said, we did reach as a community, and I say we, but there are many, many volunteers who worked very hard on this issue, and I was only sort of tangentially involved. So we, in the grander sense of the term, reached this historic milestone where the cross-community working group sent the transition plan to the U.S. government, the Department of Commerce, the National Telecommunication and Information Association, NTIA, for approval on March 10th. 2016. So what does this all mean? It means that United States oversight will effectively end pending NTIA approval, which doesn't necessarily mean that anarchy will reign and governments go away completely, but the idea is that no one government will own the internet, no one sector will control the internet. It won't be about governments, it won't be about brand owners, it won't be about privacy advocates, it won't be about users or technical service providers. It's effectively balancing representation and ensuring accountability mechanisms that keep the balance, and ultimately it will be what it sort of has been, a multi-stakeholder, bottom-up decision-making process, but in a self-governing model as opposed to always having the United States be the ultimate steward of the process. So, although we did break out the champagne, our friend J. Scott Evans from Adobe said it best in his blog on Circle ID when he said that there's still a lot of work to be done. On the accountability track, there are some what I'm going to call sticking issues. How to phrase ICANN's human rights commitment is a big issue, whether we should just sort of defer to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and integrate all of that therein, or whether or not we should sort of take a fresh look at some of the human rights issues and integrate them piecemeal is one of the suggestions. So we also are still sticking on the scope of government influence and to what extent the Government Advisory Committee can block or veto policy proposals that come through the ICANN community through, you know, the duly considered community process. And then the last sort of sticking issue that I see as a big one is defining and sticking to a specific mission statement, remit, and scope of ICANN influence in the internet naming space. So lots of work to be done, no small issues at all, and we will continue to sort of progress on those issues probably slowly, as we have done as a community. But I think everyone is really proud of the community work on this and very grateful to the people who gave a lot of time and sweat equity to reach this historic milestone to make sure that communities have a voice on the internet. The other big issue that's happening right now, as if there wasn't enough already, is the total overhaul of Whois, which is now being called Registration Directory Services. The first issue is the thick Whois implementation, which is sort of technical, so I will bounce the ball back to Matt to talk about that one.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. And just by way of background, for those of you that aren't aware, the definition of thick Whois really is where the registry itself provides the Whois output. So all of the Whois information comes directly from the registry operator in the world of thick Whois. And all of the new gTLDs have to support thick Whois. And actually, there's only 3 of the legacy gTLDs that currently are what's referred to as thin Whois, which is where the registry essentially refers the requester to the registrar. So the registrar is the entity that provides the contact information for those 3 legacy TLDs, which are .com, .net, and .jobs. And so it's been that way for really forever, and other TLDs have switched from a thin model to a thick model. Most notably, .org did it several years ago, and it always has been the plan to migrate .com and .net and .jobs over to thick Whois, but we sort of run into some implementation hurdles which really have delayed it. And most of them, as Kiran mentioned, are technical in nature. There's also some sort of other technology changes going on in the background that are kind of running into the thick Whois implementation issue altogether. That and the fact that, there is real concern about migrating, several, I don't know what .com, the .com root zone is, but it's 100 million some domains over to a thick Whois. It will not necessarily be an easy process, but again, we did do it years back with .org, which was a smaller TLD. So I think as and Kiran will talk more about the sort of registration directory services and the work there. I still believe and still hope that while all of that discussion is ongoing, and I've been going to ICANN meetings for 10 years, and Whois in general has been discussed for all 10 years that I've been going, and so to think that we're going to reach closure on this sort of reset of Whois in general, so we should hold off on implementing thick Whois, which is one school of thought and argument that we're hearing inside the community. To think that to think that the work of the Registry Directory Services Group will yield any results, frankly, if we saw a new version of Whois and we called it Registration Directory Services, if we saw that within the next 5 to 7 years, I would be impressed that it happened that quickly. So hopefully the thick Whois implementation will continue to move on in parallel with all this work that is going to happen on the sort of reboot of Whois, which I'll turn things back over to Kiran to talk about the sort of policy work that we're undergoing now with regards to the next generation of Whois.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and the IPC did speak with the ICANN board on thick Whois and sort of questioned and mildly criticized the snail's pace at which implementation is happening, especially in light of all of the other work that's going on with Whois, because if it's taking us that long to implement something that is relatively simple in light of the other issues that are facing the community regarding overhauling Whois, then we're really in for it to see any sort of improvement in Whois. And Matt's very generous to say 5 to 7 years. I would be surprised if we saw it in 10 years. So lots of work to be done. We are encouraging ICANN to find ways to be expeditious about all of these things so that we can actually start benefiting from the really positive policy developments that have happened in this space. So on that note, I'll move on to talk about where we're at on the privacy proxy services accreditation issues. Speaking of a very positive policy development, we reached a really good point of compromise in the community between balancing essentially between consumer rights and accessibility and accurate Whois and the rights of privacy and data protection. And we expected the final report to be approved and to begin implementation stages in Marrakech. However, we are seeing some stalling from governments. So the law enforcement is represented through ICANN, through the Government Advisory Committee, through a group called the Public Safety Working Group. And they had submitted comments early on in the initial report stage of Privacy Proxy Services Accreditation, where they encouraged a number of positions, that some of which were adopted and some of which were not, which ultimately represents, the politics and the compromise that occurs in the policy development process. So, however, they felt that because the final report did not reflect all of the suggestions that they had made exactly, that they wanted to sort of withhold final approval until they had a chance to look at the final recommendations more closely, which was sort of disappointing to us and the rest of the community, because we feel like there had been plenty of time to actually examine where we came out as a point of compromise. So it is stalled. The government, the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee, has recommended that we stall approval until the next ICANN meeting, which is at the end of June, and it is in Helsinki, Finland. And we think that that's actually not great. We'd like to see it happen before that. But the implementation stage will start once there's final approval. I don't foresee final approval being withheld for very much longer. It certainly wouldn't be any longer than June. And then we can start implementing the policy recommendations that we made, which will, in my opinion, ultimately help brand owners get behind some of the hurdles that we see with regard to privacy and proxy services online. The other big policy development process, which I've already spoken about a little bit, is the next generation registration directory services. We had our policy call this morning, and we have also chosen a leadership team similar to the subsequent rounds PDP, made up of a really good cross-section of the community. It's led by Chuck Gomes from Verizon. We've got Susan Kawaguchi from Facebook, and we have Michaeli Nalon, a registrar from Ireland, among others. So where are we at on that? At this point, we're still sort of scoping out issues and identifying threshold questions to even begin the discussion about how to restructure Whois. We do have guidance from the expert working group on registration directory services, which gave a report to the community a couple of years ago. MarkMonitor at the time did support that report, and we still support that report, and we support it as a starting point for the community to launch discussions. But many in the community want to revisit some of the core questions, and so what they're doing is they're splitting us up into sub-teams. They've done sort of an expert polling to see which members are have strengths in what areas, and then we're sort of issue splitting and putting experts where they belong. So, for example, I would be considered a legal expert. Matt would be considered a data and technical expert, et cetera. So, and then the main threshold question that we're dealing with is, what is the purpose of registration directory services? That is an extremely important question, especially for those of us in the brand protection and consumer protection industry. Because if the purpose does not actually include helping to address and mitigate abuse online, then there will be very little that we can do later on in the process to develop procedures and processes for third-party access. So that would be accessed by your friendly CSMs and analysts at MarkMonitor, and also internally for your own brand protection efforts. So if Whois is something that you use on a daily basis and you have a use case to present to the community for discussion, now is the time to get involved in this policy development process, either directly or through us at MarkMonitor, to make sure that your voice is heard. So I can't stress that enough. It's a very important time for Whois. Oops. So the next slide is about abuse reporting, registrars, and ICANN compliance, and I will turn it back to Matt.
Thanks, Kiran, and just to pause real quick and remind everyone that we are hopefully going to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question or comment or would like Kiran and I to address anything that we've already covered or another topic, please use the Q&A box there in the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be sure to try to get to those. So yeah, another big topic of discussion, certainly in the registrar world, is this notion of abuse reporting. And really it comes out of the 2013 Registrar Accreditation Agreement, which is essentially the most current version of the agreement that governs the relationship between all ICANN accredited registrars and ICANN as the corporation. And there are very specific requirements in there that registrars need to abide by in terms of responding to abuse complaints and having a point of contact that people can go to with abuse complaints and things like that. And so, registrars, you can only imagine, and I can only imagine how many abuse complaints, a large registrar with 5, 10, 15, 20 million domain names get, because frankly, we get a number of abuse reports just because we are the registrar of record for so many high-profile domain names. People will actually send us abuse reports. And so, we're pretty interested in making this kind of work for both parties, because obviously we submit a lot of abuse reports to registrars and ISPs around the world on behalf of our clients, but as a registrar, we also receive them. And so really what the registrar community is trying to do is to sort of, define what the role of a registrar is, what actions a registrar can take versus a hosting provider, an ISP. The registrar, when people come to MarkMonitor with a complaint about one of the domain names that we manage, as the domain name registrar, really the only thing that we can do is, deactivate the domain name. And certainly we're not going to do that, but we spend a fair amount of time educating abuse reporters about what the role of a registrar is. So there's a lot of work underway to just sort of define what a registrar can do, what they can't do, what types of information is useful to provide to a registrar in terms of what the type of abuse is, a specific URL, things like that. And so registrars are working on a sort of document that will, really become a blueprint for folks to be able to communicate out into the broader community. It will not be something essentially that is, that every registrar is contractually bound by. This is kind of more of a informal guide for folks to be able to use when they're reporting abuses to registrars. So it's a good effort, one that we're happy to participate in, and hopefully will sort of move forward to help both the registrars and the folks reporting abuse to get more to get more results out of things that are actionable. So the other topic that everyone should also be aware of is really tied to the inter-registrar transfer policy, what's called the IRTP. And this, like most things at ICANN, has been a policy process that's really been ongoing for, 7-ish years or so, maybe even more. They broke it up into A, B, C, D. I think there were 4 or 5 different parts of the inter-registrar transfer policy. And as the name suggests, it was initially designed as a policy to govern the transfer of domain names between one registrar to another. And so when you transfer a domain name from GoDaddy to MarkMonitor, there are certain requirements and authorizations that need to be gathered. Well, one of the things that's come out of this, which actually isn't inter-registrar transfer, but really more registrant transfer, so what you could think of as an ownership transfer. And again, this is really just limited to gTLDs, both new gTLDs and legacy gTLDs. And as part of the last inter-registrar transfer working group, a recommendation was put forth to put some requirements in place so that when you are changing ownership of a domain name, that both the current and the new registrant must approve all changes to that registrant contact information. And so it really came out of a desire to try to prevent domain name hijackings. So, obviously something very near and dear to our hearts, security being core to kind of what MarkMonitor has done since our inception. And so we are and have been very supportive of this, but it will be a sort of operational change when folks are going and updating registrant information. It's currently scheduled to go into effect August 1st of this year, though there is some discussion about whether or not that will slide a little bit, so we'll see. But essentially, ICANN doesn't prescribe how each registrar needs to obtain that authorization. So it will be different registrar to registrar, but very similar to the requirement of new registrant information to be validated by either email or phone. You'll see registrars that will implement this very differently based on what their business models are. And so if you're a MarkMonitor client, stay tuned for information as we move forward to rolling that out into our platform. We'll obviously communicate to you what that new process looks like, what the requirements are. But overall, I am supportive of that. Again, as just one sort of way to help combat domain name hijacking, as I've sort of preached for years, there isn't a silver bullet, one thing that's going to solve it. I think this is potentially a good step and certainly one that, like I said, we're supportive of. So as we usually do, we talk about how to get involved in ICANN, and you can see here a number of ways to follow. This being 2016, of course, ICANN has a presence on all of your favorite social networks, as you can see here. So following them there, they actually do a fairly good job getting information out there, things like when they're soliciting public comment on policy developments and things like that. This is a good way to sort of keep up with them. And then, it's also, as we also have said for years, really good to try to get actively involved in the process. As Kiran touched on earlier, there are a lot of significant policy development processes underway. Yes, they take a long time to get through the sort of ICANN machine. A lot of that, frankly, is by design. But I will say, if you are not involved in the development of the policy, then you really can't complain about the policy that gets rolled out. And so, here are three groups that we highlight to be actively involved in. One is the business constituency, which really is made up of business interests, whether it be from large corporation to small business. It really is a pretty broad focus, really just on anyone doing business online, which frankly is probably all of us on this call. The intellectual property constituency, which is, as the name suggests, really focused on intellectual property. So we have a number of clients that participate in either the IPC, as Kiran does, or in the business constituency. And then the last one here is the brand registry group. So anyone that has applied for a .brand, you can actually get involved in the registry stakeholder group and the brand registry group to be more involved, again, as a contracted party with ICANN. Even as a brand holder, you are now subject to the terms and conditions of that agreement and that contract with ICANN as a gTLD registry operator. And so, it's really important, again, to be involved in the discussions, to be involved in the policy development and the work that goes on at ICANN. Okay, so with that, I think we have got a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to manage the Q&A since I was tardy in my arrival. I guess that's my punishment. So I will manage the Q&A. And the first question we have, and Kiran, I'm going to ask you to take this one, is when will we see changes for Whois that will actually impact enforcement efforts?
Thanks, Matt, and great question. We've sort of spoken about this already. We think that when we'll see huge, sweeping global changes, the kind of things that we're talking about within the Registration Directory Services PDP, so that would be gated access and centralized Whois as opposed to, registrar and registry specific databases. That's not going to happen for some time. It'll probably be, my guess is 7 to 10 years before we see some implementation. However, there are a number of initiatives with regard to Whois that are sort of progressing more slowly but more quickly through the process because they've already had their policies developed. So Whois, the privacy proxy stuff, and some other Whois accuracy issues like the Whois accuracy specification in the 2013 RIA. And we're already seeing some positive effects of those policies. I think the fact that registrars have started developing abuse reporting general practices and guidelines is actually a response to some of the Whois policy development efforts where registrars are encouraged to help us kind of get behind some of the issues that we have with contacting registrants. So I think that probably in the next year or so, we're going to start seeing more and more sort of accessibility and accuracy in Whois, and that will continue until we sort of knock down the current structure and build a new one.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran, and I'd agree with that. I mean, I certainly, as I mentioned earlier, Whois it has, and I think forever will be, a topic that's discussed at ICANN, and it certainly is not something that we're going to see dramatic changes and shifts in overnight. But there does seem to be a sense that, at some point in the future, we will sort of hit the reset button on Whois as we think of it today. Okay, the next question is a question about new gTLDs, and so the question is whether or not there will be future rounds of applications or more of a sort of rolling application framework for adding new TLDs. Now the question is, would that model apply to generics or just specific to brands or both? And what our thoughts on that are. So when the new gTLD program was developed, fourscore and I don't know how many years ago at this point, the stated goal was actually to get to a place where you wouldn't have these sort of defined application periods where you could just eventually go to the ICANN site and submit your application for a gTLD, whether it was whatever month of the year it was or any of that stuff. And so ultimately they will get to a point where there isn't an application round or window or time frame, but it will just be kind of open in perpetuity, and anyone that wants to apply for a TLD can go through the process at any time that they want. Whether or not that happens, I do think there will be another round. So I would say there'll be a round two, and then I could see at that point it gets more kind of normalized. But I think because we've only gone through that first round, at least in the new gTLD program, and the reviews and all the sort of operational considerations that are underway in terms of the next round, I do think the next opportunity to apply will be in a defined time period, a defined round, and then at some point after that, I think would be when it gets more to that sort of steady state rolling ability to apply. Kiran, I wonder if you have any additional or differing thoughts based on what you're hearing or seeing.
Well, sort of the same ultimate conclusion. I'll just add that from a policy perspective, the reason why they did it the way that they did it is because of how the policy process works at ICANN overall, which is we set a policy, then we test it, and then we revisit the policy and we make changes, and then we go again. So the reason why we did the initial round, which was developed way before I even knew what ICANN was, back in the good old days, right? The ignorance is bliss days. And so by the time I came around, we were first opening the application round, and it was almost sort of a beta test of the policies that we had put in place to see if new gTLDs were a good idea. And so that's how we're going to move forward with this, is we are basically we're going to test how it went. We're going to do all these reviews. We may do remedial rounds, so applications from developing regions, brands, those kinds of things, and then we'll move on again to either rolling rounds, or I think what Matt said is probably correct, that we'll see another defined round to test our new policies. We'll review those, and then we'll see where we are 10 years down the road. We may new gTLDs may be something that is a very normal thing that people are just sort of implementing and applying for as we go along.
Yep, great. Kiran, the next question, I'm going to, again, ask you to talk about this. How does the IANA transition and accountability work affect brand holders ultimately?
It's a good question because I think that people are aware that it's a historic thing and that it's an important issue, but they're not necessarily sure, and I think this is common amongst a lot of our clients, what it actually means for them. I think ultimately the important thing to remember about the IANA transition and ICANN accountability is that we're making sure that we have a seat at the table of Internet governance and that no one takes that seat away and that our seat is the same height as everybody and it's as big and as cushy as everybody else's, essentially. So basically, are we at the table? Do we have a voice? Is there somebody at the table that can stifle our voice, that can capture, a policy development process and effectively eliminate our interest in an issue? And basically, the whole IAM transition and the ICANN accountability is surrounded around that issue of equity in the Internet community to make sure that all voices are equal. So it's important for us to just make sure that we have good people at the negotiation table for this transition and this stewardship process, and our interests are effectively represented, and that we have a seat at the table at the end when sort of this round table is effectively built.
Yep. Good answer. The last question I think we have, unless we've got a couple more minutes, if there's any others, and I'll give my thoughts, and then Kiran, ask you to give yours. What impact will a new CEO have on ICANN? And so, as Kiran mentioned, the Marrakech meeting was the last meeting where we saw Fadi Shahadi act as the CEO. We've got a little period of transition where the new CEO has yet to kind of come into place, but that will happen, I believe, in April or May of this year. And really, just like, with any corporation, and remember, there is, ICANN, the sort of big ICANN, which is the global community, which is all the various stakeholders, things like Kiran just talked about in the IANA transition. But then there is also ICANN, the corporation. And, it's a corporation just like every other corporation with a staff and strategic objectives and all of that stuff. And so, any time that a new CEO comes into any corporation, it has the potential to change the direction, to change the focus, to certainly if you look at the stamp that Fadi put on the organization versus the CEOs before him, they all sort of come with their different priorities, different perspectives. And so it will be interesting to sort of see how that plays out. And, I will say, being the CEO of ICANN, in my view, it's really unlike any traditional CEO, right? Because you've really got three kind of jobs. You've got running the company, which, day-to-day operations of a large global organization. Then you've got navigating the broader community. And then you've got, the sort of political aspect of it. And, Fadi spent a lot of time traveling, meeting with world governments all around the world. And so it'll be a very challenging position for him to come into, and it'll be interesting to sort of see what his priorities are for his tenure to see how that plays out. So that's my view. Kiran, if you have thoughts.
I think that being the ICANN CEO is a really challenging thing because ICANN does not operate like a business, even though it sort of does. So it's this random nonprofit. It's a bottom-up stakeholder community. Now it's accountable to itself. It's sort of all of these things that seem to be on its face just an amalgamation of catchphrases and buzzwords. So I think that all of the ICANN CEOs have struggled initially to try to reconcile their experience primarily in the private sector, although this guy will be interesting because Mr. Marby comes from the public sector, from what I understand. He does have private sector experience. So it will be interesting to see how he, like the others before him, have reconciled the difference between their past experience and the unique nature of ICANN as a community. The community generally celebrates and heralds the beginning of any CEO's tenure. It's all infused with hope. It's all very hopey and changey, as they say in the United States political forums. So we we expected everyone to be very positive at the beginning. I think that we just need to temper expectations. Fadi did spend a lot of time traveling. In fact, we saw him on the flight home from Marrakech, and he said that the doctors told him that he had no circadian rhythm left because he had actually traveled so much. So it's a challenging job. I'm not sure that it's going to be as challenging for the next guy because the transition work is largely finished at this point. But it will be interesting to see where his priorities lie, if he's still engaging with international governments, with, large internet governance organizations like Whois and IGF, which Fadi did to some success and to some controversy. So we'll sort of see what happens. It's a really interesting time for internet governance, and I guess all I can say with the new CEO is best of luck to him.
Yeah, definitely. It certainly is a tough job. So I think with that, we're right at the top of the hour. I think we got to all of the questions, but if not, please feel free to follow up with either one of us directly. And with that, I will turn things back over to Gina to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Kiran. I'd also like to thank everybody tuning in for your participation. Those were some great questions that came in. As a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation slides and a recording within the next couple of days. I know a few people asked about the slides, so just be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.